Aloha! This is chapter 18.2, and we're going to pick up the story of the French Revolution in 1789, which was a very momentous year for the French. There was a political crisis. There was an economic crisis. It was a terrible famine that had just hit France, and probably more than just France, but France was really impacted by this because they didn't have the stability or the infrastructure to deal with a bad harvest. And the peasants were particularly hard hit by the famine. They didn't have any economic cushion to fall back on. But it wasn't just the peasants. The nobility also were impacted. And one of the ways that the noble classes and the first and the second estate tried to deal with the famine was to pass on the expense to the peasants. And so, of course, this just exponentially increased the anxiety and the anger of the peasants in the situation. And it seemed as if they had no powers. But they're going to realize in this year that they have power in masses. And they're going to use that power in very scary ways. And it's actually going to topple the monarchy, and it's going to open up the possibility of creating a new, different style of government for France. So there were many different factions in Paris that were trying to compete to gain power. In 1789, Louis XVI had just called the Estates Generales, and it quickly devolved into the bourgeoisie trying to take control of the Estates Generales and being locked out of the meeting hall in the Palace of Versailles. And they moved down the road to a tennis court, and they swore an oath saying that they would not disband until they had created a new constitutional monarchy. And this was very much in line with the Enlightenment ideas and ideals of that time that said that the people should have a voice in their government, should have power within the government, and that the government was by the people and for the people. This went directly against what had been the philosophy up until this point, which was that power came from God and that the people's job was to obey those who are in authority over them. Another group was led by the Marquis de Lafayette. This group was radical. They felt like there should be a monarchy, but that the monarchy should be a constitutional monarchy. And this Marquis de Lafayette created a commune in Paris to replace the royal government that had been controlling Paris. In addition, this was the year that the Bastille was attacked by a mob of Parisians, and they actually broke into the fortress, and they killed the man who was supposed to be in charge of the fortress. They did not get any of the cache of weapons that they thought were stored in the Bastille, but they did rescue a few political prisoners that were being held there, 12. So it was not exactly actual victory, but it was mental victory for the Third Estate, because even though it didn't do anything particularly, it did symbolize an attacking and a breaking down of the old regime and of the authoritative autocratic monarchy. In late August of that year, the National Assembly wrote something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man with the help of Thomas Jefferson, and it proclaimed that all male citizens were now equal before the law. There was no longer going to be this three estates where there was basically a hierarchy of people. This, of course, really upset several feminists in the group. One in particular, her name was Olympe de Gouges, and she, in frustration, wrote her own declaration that said that women should have equality with men. Of course, though, the assembly was basically full of men, and they did not adopt this equal rights for women, nor was King Louis XVI willing to accept any of the reforms that the National Assembly was trying to create. And there was just a lot of anger. One of the big things was that many Parisians and the wider French world was particularly angry with Marie Antoinette. And she is painted as kind of like a demon or somebody who was just very heartless and cruel. But the reality is, I think she was just unaware or wasn't equipped for the job that she was supposed to be doing. So she was very young, quite sheltered, and probably did not understand the extent to which her people were suffering. The Parisians and the French thought that she was a foreigner and frivolous and purposefully spending money extravagantly. And that is to some extent true, but part of that was she was kind of rejected by the French nobility because she was Austrian, and she was also frustrated with the boredom of the French lifestyle at court. She tried to do things that were probably unwise at this time. The National Assembly produced the Constitution of 1791. It took them 2 years to actually create their first constitution, and this document was full of Enlightenment ideas. It set up a limited monarchy. It ensured equality of all male citizens as in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, and it ended the church privilege in France. This was an extremely momentous occasion because the church up till now had basically been autonomous. The church's only rule was from the Pope. This constitution basically took the church out of the Pope's hands and brought it under the control of the French government. Of course, some people thought this was a really great idea, especially those that supported the Enlightenment ideas that there should be less religious power, but then others that were very strongly Catholic and saw this as being extremely wrong. In October of 1791, the newly elected Legislative Assembly began to start to create a government that would and made decisions about currency. They actually produced their own new currency to try to solve the economic problems. They tried to solve the rising prices, food shortages, because these were all things that needed to happen, but it was not enough. And in Paris itself, women were particularly hard hit by this. One of the industries in France at this time was the fishing industry to try to find food for people. So the men would go out at night, they would fish, they would bring back their catches, and their wives would then, in the daytime, try to sell the fish so that they could support the family. With these new laws that were being passed by the Legislative Assembly, things like price caps were being put onto people like these fishermen. Out of frustration, fisherwomen decided they were going to march to Versailles and they were going to get the king and the queen and forcefully bring them back to Paris where they could keep a better eye on them. So that's about 11-mile walk. They start early in the morning. They eventually get to the gates of Versailles. No peasant has ever seen the inside of Versailles. So this is going to be very momentous. And these women are of the lowest classes. They are the kind of women that, missing teeth. They're pretty brutal. They carry knives around with them. It wouldn't have been safe anyway during this time in France, and so you would carry a knife for protection, but these women were carrying knives because they were fisher women. They would clean the fish with that knife, and then, they were scary ladies. So when they get to the gate of Versailles, the guards, instead of stopping them, basically open the gate for them and let them come in. And so they go into the huge garden of Versailles, and that's like several miles of walking down the driveway of this amazing garden. And they are overwhelmed with the luxury of this place. This garden alone would have taken millions and millions of francs to maintain it. And when they finally get up to the Palace of Versailles, they just walk in, and it's the most enormous building that is so opulent. The servants and the nobility have all heard what is happening, and they have found places to hide. So these women basically go roaming around the palace, stopping servant girls, asking if they are the queen, because they have no idea. They've never seen the queen. They don't know what she looks like. They just know that all of these women are wearing much better clothing than they have ever seen or could ever hope to own in their lifetime. Eventually, they find the queen's chambers, and it's empty because the queen, of course, has had her 2 children secreted away to the king's chambers, and so they're all huddled there waiting for this group of women. And eventually the women get to the king's chambers, and it's this most surreal moment. Instead of attacking them, they feel their hair and the clothing, and they're in awe to some extent. And then very gently, they take the royal family and they put them in a carriage and they bring them back to Paris, and they put them in the old palace, the Tuileries, which was what the French monarchs had used before the Palace of Versailles had been built. So this is a turning point in the French Revolution because it now means that the monarchy is not all-powerful. They are not in control anymore. And it kind of symbolizes that the mob is in control. These women were not organized. They were just a group of women, very scary women nonetheless, but still taking matters into their own hands.